Yeah, because people online need to hear you.
That changes it. So I was listening a lot to what you were saying in around examining beliefs then. And of course I'm thinking, so what are all the beliefs that I don't even think about that I have? And just wondering, and you said it's very individual in a way, because we all have our beliefs and the way we came to them, I guess. And the question was how much of that is mental, sort of trying to think through that, and how much of it is being open, and what else is it how else am I examining this?
I think there is a class, an entire class of beliefs which are detrimental to our happiness. And all these beliefs have a common ground, if you will. They all are offsprings of a core belief, which is the one we were mentioning, to be a limited and separate consciousness. So that we don't have really to investigate these beliefs in their multiplicity. We have to address the core belief. Once we have understood that every time we experience psychological suffering, every time, this psychological suffering can be traced back to this single belief to be a man, a woman, a separate entity. We can ask ourselves the question, where would I be if I wouldn't believe to be a man, a woman, to be a separate consciousness? And you see that this grief that we are experiencing, this psychological suffering, would instantaneously cease to exist. That it can exist only because of this belief. So then, and that I recommend to do that every time, to kind of start this mechanism every time we experience some, psychological suffering of any kind.
Physical as well?
No, psychological suffering.
Okay.
Envy, anger, disappointment, feeling of betrayal, etc. Feeling to be inadequate, feeling not to be loved, whatever. Every time we experience psychological suffering, to convince ourselves by looking at the emergence of this psychological suffering and tracing it back to this feeling of being a separate individual, a separate entity, a limited consciousness. Then that paves the way to the next step, because the next step is this. Is it true that I am a separate consciousness? Because then, now what I have done in this first step, all these problems I was having that were generating misery, as I have connected them to one single issue. It's like, how do you call that? Candelabra?
Candelabra? Chandelier?
A chandelier hanging from the ceiling through one single cable. And then you have all these crystals and stuff, right? But then once you have understood the structure of it, if you want to destroy the thing, you don't need to cut all the little cables, you just need to go at the top of it and remove it from the top. So that's very important. So then the only question now becomes, is it true that consciousness is separate? That consciousness being that which is hearing these words right now, you see? It has all been nicely reduced to one single important question. So then I can focus, you can focus then onto this question. And then the first step is, what's the evidence? And then you have to go many times and only to discover that there is no evidence. And there is a moment even you will know, you will be completely satisfied. Not only that there is no evidence that consciousness is separate, but that there is no evidence that could be possibly discovered that could establish that consciousness is separate or limited. So it is not that you, in your own vault, don't have any evidence. Is that no evidence can be added, no evidence can ever be found. It's a much more powerful understanding. And you can be convinced of that with a 100% certainty, with the same level of certainty as you can be certain that there is consciousness. You can have exactly the same level of certainty, knowing that there is no existing evidence, and nor can there ever be that consciousness is limited. And then the next step is the experiential way, if you will, is to tell yourself, well, now that I've established that I have no valid reason to believe that consciousness is separate, and since I have lived my life for so many years based upon this hypothesis, then I'm going to give some time to the alternate hypothesis and live my life from this different perspective as if consciousness were universal. And then you'll see, then you get the answer experientially the moment you do it. Now, I have divided the path in very neat steps. But in fact, you can start with step number 3 if you feel inclined to do so, you see. Logically, that would be the 4 steps. But you can try the experiential step right away. And in fact, you know, it's like let's say you learn how to play tennis, you see, and you have a coach who tells you, okay, first you learn your forehand, then you learn your backhand, then you learn your serve. But in fact, as a tennis player, you work on both, or on all the elements of your game. It's the same here.